Hey guys, this is Katie Dozier for CardsChat.com, and today we're going to be continuing on in our series, Become a Winning Poker Player in 30 Days. I'm really excited for this section, which is Day 13, Power Poker. This is a very, very key list of pre-flop shove spots and how we're basically going to be looking at it in terms of effective stack. So make sure that you're really solid on the meaning of effective stack, if you aren't already, in a previous day before going on to this section that I think is one of the absolute most important in the entire series. All right, so first of all, times to open shove. Okay, we're going to be looking at open shoving when there is a less than 15 big blind effective stack with an ante, and then also when there is less than 10 big blind effective stack without an ante. So obviously the starting pot is significantly bigger when there is an ante. So that's going to be the reason behind the fact that we are looking at 15 blinds with an ante and 10 without. So as a simple example of this, if the blinds are 50, 100, and there is an ante, and say we're on the button, we're going to be looking to shove if we have 15 blinds or less. And then if we are sitting on the same situation on the button, 50, 100 blinds without an ante, then we're going to want 10 big blinds or fewer to go ahead and be open shoving when we play a hand. If we were instead to say have 1,500 in that situation, but there is no ante, then we're not going to tend to open shove. We're going to tend to open min-raise in that scenario. So these are really important default rules to have in mind. And a lot of these rules too, you'll see really good players make mistakes short-handed because short-stacked play is often discounted in poker, which is actually one of my pet peeves, where people constantly say these rules are so easy, and yet there are quite a few players that don't follow them or know them, even worse. All right, moving right along. Now we're going to look at shoving over a single raise. So this is 3-bet shoving when we're talking about pre-flop. Okay, we're going to be looking to do this with a less than 25 big blind effective stack when there is an ante. And then, of course, it's going to be less without an ante because there's, again, less in the pot. So the risk to reward ratio is worse. So we're going to go ahead and need a shorter stack in order to do that without an ante. So less than 20 big blinds effective stack without an ante. And if these rules seem somewhat overwhelming right now, I guarantee you the more you implement them and the more you see them, they'll become completely automatic as you play more and more poker. And continuing on, so shoving in other spots, now that we have looked at open shoving or 3-bet shoving, i.e. shoving over a raise, there's 25% or more effective stack in the middle. So what we mean by this scenario is spots where there are probably multiple people already all in, and situations where there is a raise and a significant call. What you want to do is look at all the chips in the middle, including, of course, the blinds and the antes, if this is a pre-flop scenario. And we just want to look at that and say, if I were to shove, would I be shoving 4 times or less what's out there? And if the answer is yes to that question, i.e. there's 25% or more of the effective stack in the middle, then we're going to want to go ahead and tend to shove in that scenario as well. And the reason that these are so important also is because they help us to avoid really tough, obnoxious decisions post-flop when these occur pre-flop. In addition to them just being plus EV, you'll find yourself in a lot fewer tricky, obnoxious scenarios when you follow these rules pre-flop instead of, say, you know, if you decide to take a limping strategy or some sort of more passive approach. That's a big reason. Secondary to, of course, these being plus EV proven poker moves that are very, very important, particularly for playing shorter stack tournaments. And of course, though, it being poker, you can never say always or never, even though I just did, right? There are always times to modify the guidelines, and that is the one thing that is always true in poker and when it comes to poker rules. So we will talk about that somewhat. but I think that something I learned when majoring in creative writing applies to poker in this scenario, which is in order to break the rules, you have to know the rules. And with writing, that kind of is meant to be applied to grammar and sort of the mechanics of storytelling. But in poker, it means a lot of rules like this. The rules are there because they are profitable in the long run. However, sometimes you can do better than the rules. And you just have to have the rules down seamlessly in order to be able to recognize those times. So common times where modifying these guidelines is going to be profitable is going to be when you're facing opponents that are kind of on extremes. So if they're extremely passive, or if they have some sort of extremely reliable tell. If, for example, you know this guy you're up against only limps when he has monsters, of which there are more people like that than there probably should be in poker, but I'm happy about that. And so, for example, there, whereas it would be a default if you're following the guidelines decision to just 3-bet shove over a limp, if you had, say, 15 blinds or fewer without an ante in that scenario, you can mix that up and say, hey, there's a disproportionately high chance that this guy is trapping, so instead of taking the shove, I'm going to mix it up. Or, if it's up against a really passive opponent who, say, has to limp any suited semi-connector, and you're looking down at 15 blinds, and instead of going ahead and just shoving, which would be following the guideline, shoving over this player's limp, would be following that. Instead of that, you decide to take an exploitive line and go ahead and 5x it. And that can be a lot more profitable in the long run versus that type of opponent that you have a specific read on. But I want to caution this by saying, most of the time when I've had students come to me with spots that they think are special in terms of doing this, most of the time they're not. It's going to be rare that you do better, in my experience, particularly playing low and mid stakes. Rare that you do better by adjusting from these guidelines. But there are definitely times, and of course we're talking about those as well. So another fun time, is the best time to modify the guidelines, is when you decide to make exploitive play with premium hands. So let's say you're under the gun with 12 blinds and it is post-ante, so the guidelines would definitely say to go ahead and shove with the range you're going to play. But you look down at aces and you think, hey, this table's mainly made up of players that aren't going to think it's suspicious, if I can get the word out, to go ahead and min-raise. Then you can go ahead and do that and take advantage of the fact that these players aren't going to be aware that you're following the guidelines to the extent that you are. And it's important to recognize tables that you're doing that at. And a lot of them, if you're playing at good soft tables, that's going to be by far the most common time to go ahead and modify the adjustments to these guidelines. With looking at the first couple of examples on this slide, those are going to tend to be rarer times. It's a bit more rare, particularly in low and mid stakes online poker, for you to have the kind of read I was talking about that would necessitate changing to be more profitable in the first couple. But hopefully you're getting more than your fair share, or at least your fair share, of premium hands, and that's going to be a really popular time instead of making what appears to be a long ball type shove to go ahead instead and be min-raise opening, or even the occasional sassy limp with those kinds of hands, though of course those aren't going to be the default. So now that we've talked about the different guidelines for power poker play, let's go ahead and look at a few hands that exemplify this better. All right, well, speaking of premium hands, I figure we'd start out with the most premium. Unfortunately, they aren't all black aces, which are my favorite, but I'll settle for two different colored ones. All right, so here we look around and see that the effective stack is going to be ours because of villain covering us in this hand. Now, instead of, though, going ahead and just taking the line of open shoving, because we have this premium hand too, we are going to just go ahead and min-raise. Hope to get shoved over, or secondary to that, getting called in the big blind, and going to go ahead and just try to get it in once we do end up seeing a flop with our premiums. Now, one negative to doing this sort of exploitive play, of course, is that if you have a sub-premium hand that is still a very, very good hand, say like ace-queen offsuit, you are going to face some scenarios post-flop where you need to potentially consider folding. So if you are not as versed in post-flop play, that would be something where I would say you should be more inclined to stick to the guidelines until you become more comfortable with post-flop play. That described myself for a long time because I started out in playing Super Turbo S&Gs, and when I made the transition over to MTT S&Gs and games, eventually MTTs, games where post-flop play was much, much more a part of it, I had to really hone my post-flop play. So while I was transitioning, I would tend to take the guideline, more seriously than I do today because I'm a lot more comfortable playing post-flop than I used to be. So moving on to the next hand here. Now, not as pretty a hand here with this ace-deuce, but we are sitting on 5 blinds here, and it's post-ante, so this is a very easy decision to go ahead and go with this. We're going to go ahead and open shove. Something else that you can do to throw your opponents off that is essentially the same as going all in is if you're on a really short stack, even shorter perhaps than 5 blinds, you can make it something like if I had, let's say, 799 chips to start this hand, I would tend to actually prefer 3xing, so making it 750 and leaving myself those 44 chips or whatever behind to go ahead and get in later, because you can increase your fold equity that way if players aren't paying attention, because it looks like just a 3x instead of, wow, I'm getting the odds to call with any 2 in that scenario in the big blind, which they would be if we had started this hand with 799 chips. So the non all in is a way to still be following the guideline, but something else to think about as another move to add to your arsenal. Of course, you want to make sure you're not playing with a weak internet connection in order to do that. I have definitely been burned by that before, made a non all in, and then my internet went out, and guess what? I did not get to put all my chips in the middle, so that's a negative to that kind of play. So here we're under the gun with 10 blinds. It is post-ante. But even if it weren't post-ante, I would like going ahead and just shoving this and shoving any hand that we are going to play. I do not have a limping range here. I do not have an open range here. My play here is shove or fold with this stack size, unless I'm doing something extremely tricky, which would be very rare in that scenario, because anytime you're sitting on 10 blinds or fewer, if you do opt to min raise and you're at a table with regs, the regs are very likely going to pick up on that as being something that stands out. And if you're a reg, you should be picking up on that too, and definitely looking for scenarios where you can get away where you otherwise couldn't. So that's one of the dangers of exploitive play. So here we have an interesting scenario that's a bit more nuanced than some of the other hands we've been looking at so far. So I think you guys would agree at this point in day 13 that we could go ahead and shove here. And instead, though, we also can, our hand is very strong. So if we think especially that a lot of the players behind us are aggressive players, hopefully not regs, because then they might think our hand looks suspicious in fact, but we can go ahead and get away with min raising here with the plan of being very happy to call it off. The idea in doing that is trying to leave the other player's range open for players that are likely to go ahead and 3-bet shove, whereas we think they're more inclined to 3-bet shove over us with a wider range than they are to call if we go ahead and shove here. Most of the time, however, I am going to be default open shoving this, but I think min raising is an option that works here as well too. So what we want to note in this hand is not get confused by what Villain 62 is doing, which is calling with 120 chips behind. So this is definitely something where they can be taking advantage of the fact that I'm playing a lot of tables and try to force a misclick, getting 1,000,000,000 to 1 once they go ahead and shove here. But what I like to do in this scenario is make sure when I notice this, I just go ahead and push the action, get it in, make sure that I'm not overtaken by that 120. However, for all the reasons that I'm kind of afraid of this, in terms of, being the one to face it and how atrocious it would be if somehow I accidentally folded if I hadn't shoved and this player shoved his 120 chips. This is a really good option for us to be doing ourselves for all the reasons that it's making me nervous when Villain is doing it. So that's definitely something to keep in mind as well. And here we're going to be getting to our quiz question, which we're going to have a few more of in this particular video. So I think that there are a lot of different scenarios we talk about on this day, and they're so important. So the first question is just going to be, what should we do here with any hand that we're choosing to play? I think we all agree ace queen suited is among that range. And again, today is not about the specific range that we are going to be going within these spots, but rather just when it is a shove or not when we are playing these hands. So in this particular hand, what are we going to be doing when we're playing a hand? And the answer is, this is going to match our slide about shoving over a single raise. And we are looking at a stack. Pause it right now if you want to give yourself a moment to think before I start getting into the answer, which I'm going to do right now. We are sub 25 blinds, and there has been a raise. And we are post ante. So we are going to be 3-bet shoving for deeper even than this, if need be. But definitely this is a spot where we should go ahead and shove. I would not want to see a call here. We are too shallow to go ahead and call and want to go ahead and be doing this. There's not a single hand, i.e. in the range, that I'm going to be calling with, unless, of course, it falls under our times to modify. If I was trapping with a super premium hand, could be a real time to go ahead and do that. Now we're going to look at a different scenario where we are in the big blind. Villain 167 has gone ahead and min-raised. What are we going to do here with our range? And the answer to that is we are going to shove or fold. I am not going to have a scenario here where I flat. I think a lot of the more tempting hands that we could have to go ahead and flat, say like 9-10 suited, things like that, that I think some players would definitely go ahead and flat with. I don't like doing that because they're profitable to go ahead and 3-bet shove, and there's almost $2,000 out there. That is a huge part of our stack. We are a sub 20 blind stack, so we even have fewer chips than we would need. This is again the 25 or fewer rule because of the fact that there is an ante in play. So I'd be very happy to go ahead and simply shove this. We do get called in this spot, and unfortunately it was by a pretty darn big hand for that scenario. And moving right along to the next quiz question. So this is a spot we haven't looked at yet. In this scenario, there is a limp and an over limp. And so there are 2 limps in front of us, and we look down at ace 10. So what should we be doing in this hand is the quiz question here. And the answer can be somewhat deceptive. We're making sure that you are paying attention to the effective stack. Superficially, if you didn't check around to the effective stack and just looked at ours, you would say, hey, I have, the effective stack is 30 blinds. You would be wrong, of course, if you said that. The effective stack is 30 blinds, and so we're too deep to go ahead and shove over this. So that would be correct if that was actually the effective stack. But in fact, because we are the biggest stack, the second biggest stack in this scenario is the player to our left, Villain 174. The effective stack there is 1783. So because of that, we are actually at a sub 20 blind effective stack. Again, which is shallower than we need to make this a shove, because if we were dealing with a slightly more, we could go ahead and shove 2 over these limps. Of course, it is a bit different than if there was a raise, because there would be more in the pot, presumably, if the player had made it over 2x. Otherwise, there'd be the same in the pot. So we are going to go ahead in this scenario and shove. So the only time I wouldn't be shoving here would be, it should be a quiz question here. Why wouldn't you shove here if there was a reason or a time where you weren't? If you're always shoving, hey, that's totally fine. But a reason that I would like it is if we had a really big hand. Okay, again, so if we had, and these players aren't regs. Well, we kind of know they're not regs because regs aren't going to be limping here anyway. So making it, 400, 300, or 400, trying to induce a shove over that raise, that would be a scenario that I would be very happy to go ahead and do that with. So we're going to look at this run out, even though today's video is not about run out, which is part of why I think it's even more important. Okay. Now we're going to look at this hand with ace jack. So again, this one is playing out post ante. And quiz question, what are we going to do here? I think that you guys are probably ready to just say that we would go ahead and shove here. This is a sub 20 blind stack. We are post ante. So again, we could have 25 blinds and still want to go ahead and the 3-bet shove this in this scenario. And we end up winning that one. I feel like these hands we haven't been running as good in for some reason. So we are getting now to the last hand we're going to look at in this video. And therefore the last quiz question also of day 13. So let's hope that you can nail it and be ready to move on to day 14. So here we have this player who is the chip leader. We are 3-handed in this tournament, probably a 180 man or 45 man actually. And this player is going to go ahead and min raise, and so the question is just, well, what do we do here? And again, we are looking at a 20 blind effective stack. And I also want to point out too, this is an ICM intensive spot because of the fact that we are the mid stack and we're in the money. So this is a scenario where it's even more important to only be playing shove fold than it would normally be, you know, if we weren't the mid stack where you should tend to tighten up. Now ICM, of course, is a whole nother day, a whole nother video, but for right now, it definitely influences things. And our full house is sadly not good, but you know what was good? Our shove was good. And the APES guidelines, I think, are just super important for playing tournament poker. And they're one of those things that I think when I was first starting playing, or when I was first moving into tournaments that played a bit deeper than the super turbos I started out with, would have been really helpful for me. So I hope that it's good information for you guys too, and that you ace the quiz so that you can go ahead and move on to the important stuff that's filled it with day 14. So thanks to you guys so much for watching. This is Katie Dozier and Colin Moshman for CardChat.com's course, Become a Winning Poker Player in Just 30 Days.